Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get right to our panel right now. Joining us here in Washington is Omar Samad. He served as the Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. Also in the studio, we have Shuja Nawaz. He's a distinguished fellow at the South Asia Center with the Atlantic Council. With us from California is Asfandyar Mir. He is a fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. And with us as well on the set, Marvin Weinbaum. He's the director of the Afghanistan and Pakistan Program at the Middle East Institute. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Ambassador, let me start with you. So the United States announces that it's come to some kind of agreement on a draft framework for peace with the Taliban. The glaring omission, of course, is that we don't hear of what the Afghan government said or were they involved in this.
Well, we do know that the Afghan government was not involved in this, and so Mr. Khalilzad came to Kabul to brief them, and plus he also briefed the rest of the Afghan political class, the main players, including ex-President Karzai, and people like Minister Atmar, who is running for presidency, and others. But what is important is to say that, yes, there's hope, yes, there's a framework, yes, there are elements within this framework that have been discussed, but there is obviously, there's no detail about how far they have gone into these issues, what has been tentatively or fully agreed to, and what is linked to another piece of the puzzle. It's a puzzle that has several pieces. It's a chain with different sort of, attachments to it. And you can't reach one and move on to the other without resolving one issue. For example, the ceasefire has to be dealt with not only by the Americans, but also by the Afghans as well, Kabul in general, the future of the political setup, how the Americans are going to withdraw, what are the details of this withdrawal, how long it's going to take, what is the scale, so on and so forth. So these are details that are not known yet, and I think that the Afghan people in general feels a bit uneasy about it, because as your reporter said, they do not want to they want to make sure that they do not lose momentum with the gains of the last 17 years.
Why do you think the United States did not include the Afghan authorities, the Afghan government in this?
Very simple. The Taliban do not want to talk to the Afghan government as a government. I think they are willing to talk to an array of Afghans, political leaders, including the government, including representatives of the government, but not under the heading of a government, because they feel that then their struggle against this entity would be meaningless. They could not explain it to their fighters. It makes sense to some extent, but the burden now is on Kabul. It's on President Ghani, but as well as the rest of the political class, to come together and to form a consensus on the way forward and on an agenda that would then help the Americans maybe set up a discussion around the table with the Taliban.
Marvin, what do you make of this announcement and this process? President Trump has already said that he wants to pull out at least half the number of American troops that are in Afghanistan right now. There's 14,000 troops. He wants to get half out. But the Taliban, at the same time, is saying, we want to see a timetable for that.
Yes, well, the Taliban clearly have focused on this question of American forces. They have made as a precondition up until now that any talks be conditioned on ultimately a guarantee of American departure. The problem there is that most would agree with the view that were the United States to pull out precipitously, that this could bring about a collapse of the security forces of Afghanistan. So in effect, what the Taliban may be saying is, why don't you take from the table those very forces which are contributing toward the stability of the country and remove them, because then you can very well argue this clears a path for the Taliban to have either a military victory, and they have made enormous progress, or to then be in a position of such strength that they can dictate the terms of an agreement. Let me just add one thing, that this framework is a framework for the United States. It's not a framework it's a framework to arrange for an American departure which doesn't look like Vietnam.
Point is, Marvin, is that this agreement probably consists of terms and conditions. And if those terms and conditions are broken at some future point, how does the United States enforce them?
Well, of course, everyone must ask not just this agreement, but any further agreements which would be in a much more complex set of terms which have to yet be negotiated.
Right.
This is just the very first step. It's just getting to talk about talks.
Right.
And I think we have to keep that in mind.
Shuja Nawaz, this is what the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, had to say about peace in the country. Let's watch this.
No Afghan wants foreign troops in their country for the long term. But the current presence of foreign forces is based on need, and this need has always been contemplated and will be contemplated based on how many foreign forces there are in Afghanistan.
One of the things that Ashraf Ghani has also said that the key to peace is in Pakistan. Pakistan was not part of the negotiations either.
Quite right,
Yeah.
But not Pakistan alone. I think a very big missing piece in the chain that Omar was talking about earlier is the region. Iran is missing from this piece. Russia is missing from the piece. China is missing from the piece. And the US has almost abandoned the approach of the Quad that it had taken at one time to involve them. There's really been no parallel track to the direct bilateral negotiations between the Taliban and the United States. To go back to your opening comment about this, there seems to be a lot of hope. But as Secretary of State George Shultz once said, hope is not a policy. I think we need to keep that in mind. And as Ambassador Khalilzad himself has said, nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. There are so many missing pieces. This is, for instance, within Afghanistan, no longer a unity government, it's a disunity government because the elections are now upon us. And most members of the government who have not left the government are unsure of where their loyalties will lie. And so it's going to be very tough to have a solid front in discussing or confronting the Taliban when the next phase of the discussion ensues. The other missing piece in all of this is there is no idea from the United States about the future of Afghanistan and its economic and financial needs and how it fits into a regional framework so that the US is not the only one guaranteeing that the other countries in the region are going to provide security and economic assistance to Afghanistan. That's a missing piece. And my fear is that the US is not just losing this war because it said it would win it militarily, that it's going to lose the peace also.
One quick point, Shuja, and that is, you've pointed out all the major players that are missing from these negotiations. So with all, countries like Iran, Russia, China, Pakistan not involved, what's driving America to come to this agreement? What's pushing the Americans?
I think it's the president. The president made, in my view, the right decision that the US should really be thinking about leaving because it hasn't achieved its objective.
Right.
And what's happening in the background is quite interesting. You see that the Pakistani foreign minister has been on a kind of a regional tour. Probably, and I'm just guessing because the US has not acknowledged this, doing so at the behest of the United States because the US won't talk to Iran, won't talk directly to Russia. And not only that, but 2 days ago, Zamir Kabulov, the special representative of Russia, was in Islamabad again. And so there is some discussion going on a parallel track as to how to guarantee the peace once the United States departs.
Can I quickly add that Zal Khalilzad has consulted with all these countries except Iran, with whom they don't have direct talks.
Right.
And he apparently is going to probably continue to do so. And the Russians are thinking about organizing another forum in Moscow very soon where they want all sides to participate.
Right.
So there is and there isn't some movement on the regional front.
All right, let me bring in Asfandyar Mir. He's at Stanford University. Asfandyar, of course, there's been lots of talk about this latest effort at peace. There's even talk that this could bring an end to America's longest war. But efforts have been made before to end this war in Afghanistan. What's different this time? Is anything different?
So I think the key difference here, as Shuja pointed out, is President Trump. He's extremely reluctant to keep U.S. military forces engaged in Afghanistan as well as the broader Middle East. Per one account, the U.S. government is spending close to $50 billion in Afghanistan. President Trump would not like that kind of money, American taxpayer money, to be spent on that country. So I think he's the real critical difference which has led to the U.S. government shifting its priorities, lowering the bar on what it sees as an acceptable end state settlement for Afghanistan. So that's a key driver. And I think that has been enabled in the last year or so by the departures of two key members of his cabinet. General H.R. McMaster was prematurely retired from his position. Then the resignation, or I should say, the dismissal of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis also played a role. So as a result of that, I think Zalmay Khalilzad has been able to offer more in terms of concessions, explicit guarantees that are somewhat palatable to the Afghan Taliban, which is, I think, driving the process. And previous attempts going as far back as, say, 2010, 2011, I think the Afghan Taliban were willing to offer similar concessions, if not, outrightly same concessions. But at this point, it seems like those concessions are more acceptable to the U.S.
Go ahead, Marvin.
I would question the idea of concession here. As it has happened, the Taliban have, for many years now, said that they have no association with Al-Qaeda, that they have broken those that existed in the 90s. So it's difficult to see just what they're giving away. I know what they're getting in return, and that is, again, the importance of the American forces leaving. So I think we have to ask ourselves what kind of a trade-off this is. But the important thing is that it does nothing to spell out what a peace would look like in the future. That is, what kind of government would emerge from all of this? That's the real question here. There's reason to be concerned that what the Taliban want is more or less a restoration of the Islamic Emirate that they had in the 1990s. We know that the Kabul government here is committed to a democratic constitutional system, however poorly that may have worked out over these years. Nevertheless, that is their aspiration. And they have a great deal to show for it in terms of progress over these 17 years have brought a great deal of progress to the country in spite of everything else. So we have potentially a real clash here of visions.
Do you agree, Ambassador, that the Taliban's ultimate intention is to go back to what was there prior to 2001?
Well, just today they announced that they are willing to govern differently and not in the same manner. Now, it's easy to say, but is it really what they believe in, and is it really part of their agenda to share power or to begin with? And what kind of order, political order, is going to emerge out of all these talks, where you have the modern Afghanistan post 9/11 with the vision from the 1990s that the Taliban may still be holding? And so how do we come to terms means that Afghans from all walks of life, in a very representative and inclusive manner, need to sit down, including the Taliban, and work on the best solutions and the best order that could be acceptable to the country and provide political stability as well as safety and security to its citizens.
There is another view in the United States, Ambassador, and that is a view we heard from Ryan Crocker, who's the former ambassador to Iraq and Afghanistan. He said that these negotiations are a, quote, surrender.
Well, I don't think there's a surrender yet. We have been talking and we've been trying to find a peaceful solution for many years. 2010, I remember at the Lisbon conference, there was a decision taken by the whole international community with the Afghan government back then under Hamid Karzai to move towards full disengagement and withdrawal from Afghanistan. But things happened along the way, including security matters. Now, security is going to be very important. And how the Taliban will deal with the withdrawal of American forces as well as with Afghan forces that are on the field right now. How do we find ways to integrate them? How do we demobilize? How do we deal with issues that have to do with sharing power, as I said earlier? These are all things that have to be worked out amongst Afghans, but the international community has to play a constructive role, and the United States has a responsibility to make sure that it does not create a vacuum and make sure that there is no collapse that would then be then problematic for everyone.
Marvin, one of the key conditions that the Americans have laid down is that Afghanistan does not become a haven for international terrorism again. How does it get that assurance?
Well, it can't get that assurance because that assumes that the Taliban, if they came to power, would be able to guarantee just that. Yeah. The fact is they have an adversarial relationship with Islamic State, with Al-Qaeda, presumably, as well. You know, there's a basic flaw here, and that is the sense that today is like the 1990s, when the government of the day fell, the Taliban walked in. This is very different. At that time, there was pretty much unified command on both the side of the Northern Alliance, as it was called, and the Taliban. Today, it's a much more complex picture. The Taliban are not a unified group, and while they may be unified in wanting to overthrow the government, once they would taste power, it would be a different situation. And of course, the danger here of ethnic, regional power brokers. And so what I'm getting at here is that the likely scenario is not one of one force leaving, the other force arriving, but a civil war. And I think that's the nightmare that we have and that the region has, because they don't want to see a complete Taliban victory. They're worried about that. They like to see them included, but they don't want to return to the 1990s.
Shuja, what about the support?
Sure. If I can...
Yeah, go ahead.
If I can sort of add on the issue of Al-Qaeda, I think there's good reason to be skeptical that the Afghan Taliban are actually going to distance themselves from Al-Qaeda. For one, what they've put on the table is a generic, a very general commitment that they are going to prevent Afghan territory from being used for international terrorism. So far, in all of the press releases, internal communications that I have seen, I have not come across a specific reference to Al-Qaeda or to a denunciation of Al-Qaeda. So that's one reason to be skeptical. The other reason is the fact that as recently as 2018, we continue to find evidence of some kind of cooperation between Al-Qaeda and Afghan Taliban at the tactical and operational levels. In fact, Al-Qaeda's South Asia branch, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, in its official charter, which it issued in 2017, sees supporting the return of the government of Afghan Taliban, the Islamic Emirate, as a key priority, and it tells its fighters to support the efforts and insurgency of the Taliban.
Okay, Shuja, let's get back to the role of Pakistan. The government led by Imran Khan, Prime Minister Imran Khan, says that they support what is going on, this peace process. In fact, Imran Khan said that they helped in this dialogue and he wants to see peace. But at the same time, Pakistan has been accused of giving sanctuary to the Afghan Taliban and also supporting the Afghan Taliban. So how does Pakistan do both of those things?
Very carefully. And that's the way they've played it over the years, and they will continue to play it that way. And I think the reason is that when the US leaves the region, Pakistan will still be there. It'll be a neighbor of Afghanistan. It wants to maintain a reasonable relationship with its neighbors to the east and to the west. So Pakistan has to be very careful. I think Pakistan, particularly the military, has for many years recognized the danger of Al-Qaeda as well as IS. The Islamic State, which has not been mentioned in the discussions much recently, but many of the, and I agree with Marvin and Asfandyar, many of the franchisees or the local commanders of the Taliban also have multiple loyalties. And they're very easily swayed one way or the other for internal political purposes. And that is not something that would assist Pakistan in trying to have a stable strategic relationship with Afghanistan to the west. I think that is something that worries them. We're also assuming that the Taliban are in a position as they were in 1990s to come to power in Kabul. I think, and I may be overly optimistic on this front, but I happen to think that there are enough people inside Afghanistan, particularly the vast growing urban population and the youth, that will resist any such takeover. And that is why it is very critical that the United States puts forward a financial framework and a commitment to Afghanistan, which was what the Soviet Union failed to deliver on. And when they pulled their money, the government collapsed in Kabul.
Go ahead, Marvin.
You know, I would be skeptical here about the ability here of the people of the country. I know they would, at the moment, we could say they have an investment in this. There's an enormous amount of human capital that has been built up over the last 17 years, and I think we should not underestimate these. Yeah. These people do want to see success of the kind of government in which they can prosper. You don't prosper under the Taliban.
Okay.
But what we're looking at here is the potential here of millions of refugees. If there's if the Taliban return, or if there is a civil war, what we are then, I think, looking toward here is an outflow of these very people I'm talking about.
I don't think civil war serves anybody's purpose, internally or externally. Seriously, chaos in Afghanistan would be a lose-lose proposition. And what we are looking for is a win-win proposition, and making sure that the Afghan people win on the same side that the Taliban feel that they are now part of a structure that works for all sides. Now, on the counterterrorism issue, I think that the American side is very cognizant of the fact that it cannot leave Afghanistan without having an arrangement of sorts on counterterrorism.
They have talked about an arrangement.
Yes.
Carl Eichenberry was former commander and former ambassador, actually. He said part of that arrangement would be some kind of UN-mandated force, which would involve the
multinational, maybe a multinational engagement that would assure and guarantee some type of security arrangement that includes counterterrorism as part of it. And I would say that they are working on this. At the same time, I'm hearing that they're working on a peace dividend, which is what Shuja is trying to allude to. And this peace dividend will include further assistance to Afghanistan, making sure that the Taliban understand that in return for behavior, good behavior, that the country and they would benefit from that. And the Afghan institutions would be protected. What has been built over the years would be protected, that the human capital would not have to flee, and that we wouldn't have millions of refugees. So I think that if the Americans are cognizant of this and they take care of these issues, the Afghans at this point need to put their house together and make sure that they follow a certain path and are all on the same page.
Okay. Asfandyar, very quickly, we've only got about a minute and a half left. There have been some details. I don't know whether these details were leaked out, but there was a report put together by the RAND Corporation, which is a US think tank. And the RAND Corporation has drawn up a peace plan that includes a transitional government, a power-sharing plan, changes to the constitution in Afghanistan, and amnesty. Do you see that happen, a power-sharing government?
No, I mean, I think the key challenge right now is that the Afghan Taliban are strongly defying calls to speak to the Afghan government. And, you know, starting a conversation, the two sides sitting down on a table and talking to each other would be a first step to a very complicated road of a power-sharing arrangement settlement. And Afghan Taliban are, I believe, relatively confident of a military victory in case of a US drawdown. And therefore, I think such proposals appear to be unlikely. It seems like the Afghan Taliban are confident that they can take Kabul and other major urban centers of Afghanistan without such an understanding with the political order that has existed in Afghanistan since 9/11.
Ambassador, 15 seconds.
Yes, a transitional period. I'm not talking about an interim government yet. A transitional period is being discussed in Kabul among all circles, including the government right now.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter @CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.